On Christmas Eve, 1914, something happened that almost sounds impossible. Thousands of British and German soldiers who had spent months trying to kill each other voluntarily stopped fighting. They climbed out of their trenches, walked into no man's land, exchanged gifts, buried their dead together, and for a brief moment saw each other not as enemies, but as ordinary men. It became known as the Christmas Truce. More than a century later, it remains one of the most extraordinary moments in military history. The remarkable part is that none of it was planned. It happened because ordinary soldiers, exhausted by months of fighting, made their own decision. To understand why, we have to go back to the beginning of the war. When Europe went to war in August 1914, almost everyone expected the conflict to be short. Politicians promised quick victories. Many young men believed they would return home before Christmas. Instead, the war changed within a matter of months. Early advances stalled. Neither side could break through the other's defenses. Across Belgium and northern France, both armies dug trenches to protect themselves from machine guns and artillery. Those trenches stretched for hundreds of miles, from the North Sea to the Swiss border. What had started as a war of movement became a war of endurance. By December, the front had barely moved. Life inside the trenches was miserable. Rain transformed the ground into deep mud. Water collected at the bottom of the trenches, soaking boots and clothing for days at a time. Rats thrived among food scraps and the bodies of fallen soldiers. Lice spread rapidly through uniforms and blankets. The smell was constant. Mud, smoke, wet clothing, rotting sandbags, human waste, death. Sleep was unpredictable. Food was often cold. Every day carried the risk of sudden artillery fire or a sniper's bullet. Even raising your head above the trench could be fatal. Between the opposing trench lines stretched an area known as no man's land. It was a landscape of shell craters, shattered trees, broken equipment, and barbed wire. In some sectors it measured several hundred meters across. In others, British and German trenches stood less than 50 meters apart. Sometimes they were close enough for soldiers to hear conversations. They could hear laughter, arguments, songs, even the sound of cooking. Every day followed almost the same pattern. Before dawn, both sides stood ready in case of a surprise attack. This routine became known as Stand To. After sunrise came repairs. Damaged trenches needed constant maintenance. Sandbags had to be replaced. Duckboards repaired. Water removed whenever possible. Snipers watched for movement. Artillery struck without warning. At night, working parties ventured into no man's land to repair barbed wire or recover supplies. It was dangerous work. Many never returned. Weeks turned into months. The excitement that had filled Europe at the beginning of the war disappeared. For the soldiers at the front, survival became far more important than victory. Interestingly, something unexpected also began to happen. Not everywhere, not all the time, but in many sectors of the front. It was never official. No agreements were signed. Yet many soldiers quietly settled into routines that reduced unnecessary bloodshed. If one side avoided firing during breakfast, the other often did the same. Repair parties working after dark were sometimes left alone. Artillery units occasionally fired deliberately long or short of their targets, satisfying orders without causing unnecessary casualties. Neither side trusted the other, but both understood one simple truth. Every bullet fired without reason usually brought another bullet back. This uneasy understanding never stopped the war. Patrols still clashed, raids still happened, men still died every day. But it revealed that the soldiers facing one another shared the same fears. They lived in the same mud, endured the same cold, missed the same families. As Christmas approached, reminders of home became impossible to ignore. Letters arrived from wives, parents, and children. Parcels contained socks, scarves, tobacco, chocolate, homemade treats, and Christmas cards. German troops were also sent thousands of small Christmas trees. The trees, many decorated with candles, were intended to bring a little comfort to men spending Christmas far from home. For many soldiers, it was impossible not to wonder what their families were doing. Children opening presents, church bells ringing, and families gathered around dinner tables. Yet, they remained surrounded by mud and barbed wire. Then came Christmas Eve. As darkness settled over the trenches on December 24th, something unusual broke the silence. British soldiers began hearing voices from the German trenches. At first, they could not understand the words. Then, they recognized the melody. The Germans were singing Christmas carols. One song stood out above all the others. Stille Nacht, Silent Night. Captain Sir Edward Hulse of the Scots Guards later described hearing the Germans singing drifting across no man's land. British soldiers listened quietly. Then they answered with carols of their own. Soon, both sides were singing, different languages, the same melodies. For a brief time, the sounds of war gave way to music. In several sectors, German soldiers placed their small Christmas trees along the tops of their trenches. The candlelight could be seen from the British lines. Some soldiers shouted greetings across the darkness. "Merry Christmas!" Others called out that they would not shoot if the British did not shoot either. British soldiers answered in return. The exchange continued for hours in some places. Not everyone joined in. Elsewhere along the front, artillery still fired, rifles still cracked through the night. The Christmas truce was never universal. It depended entirely on local conditions and the decisions of the men occupying each stretch of trench. But wherever the singing replaced the gunfire, something began to change. The enemy became a voice, then a face. As Christmas morning arrived, curiosity slowly overcame fear. In several sectors, German soldiers cautiously climbed onto the edge of their trenches. Some raised their hands to show they carried no weapons. Others simply stood where they could be seen. For several long moments, nothing happened. Then, British soldiers did the same. No officer had ordered it, no bugle announced it. One cautious step was followed by another. Slowly, men from both armies walked into no man's land. The place that had represented certain death only hours earlier suddenly became a meeting place. Nobody knew how long the moment would last, or whether the next gunshot would end it. Within minutes, no man's land was filled with men who, only the day before, had been trying to kill one another. Many greeted each other with handshakes. Others smiled awkwardly, unsure of what to say. Few spoke the other's language, but that mattered surprisingly little. Some German soldiers had worked in Britain before the war and spoke English. Others relied on gestures, broken phrases, and shared laughter. Lieutenant Johannes Niemann of the German army later recalled meeting British soldiers in no man's land and exchanging greetings as if they had been neighbors rather than enemies. He remembered photographs being taken and souvenirs being exchanged before everyone eventually returned to their own lines. British soldier Frederick Heath also described the atmosphere as friendly and almost unbelievable. Men who had spent months firing at one another now stood talking openly in the middle of the battlefield. The gifts they exchanged were simple but meaningful. Chocolate, tobacco, cigarettes, buttons, badges, food. Some traded pieces of their uniforms. Others exchanged addresses, hoping they might meet again after the war under different circumstances. One German barber even offered haircuts to British soldiers. Many simply wanted to satisfy their curiosity. They had imagined the enemy for months. Now they could finally see the faces behind the uniforms. Again and again, soldiers reached the same conclusion. The men standing opposite them looked remarkably similar to themselves. They were tired, cold, homesick. Most had never wanted a long war. One of the most important events of the truce involved the dead. For weeks, bodies had remained in no man's land because neither side could recover them safely under constant fire. During the truce, British and German soldiers worked side by side, collecting those who had fallen. Temporary burial services were held in several sectors. Prayers were read. Some accounts describe soldiers from both armies standing together with heads bowed while the dead were buried. It was one of the few moments during the war when enemies openly shared the same grief. The story most people know today is that the soldiers played football. There is truth behind that story, but it is often simplified. Several eyewitnesses reported footballs appearing in no man's land. In some places, soldiers kicked balls back and forth. A few accounts describe informal matches between groups of British and German soldiers. However, historians caution that there was never one giant football game stretching across the Western Front. The games were local, spontaneous, and differed from sector to sector. What is beyond dispute is that soldiers laughed together, talked together, and in some places, played together. For a short time, the battlefield no longer resembled a battlefield. News of the truce quickly spread. Letters home described the extraordinary events. Some newspapers published the soldiers' stories. Not everyone was pleased. Senior officers on both sides viewed the fraternization as a serious threat to military discipline. They feared that soldiers who had shaken hands with the enemy might hesitate the next time they were ordered to attack. New instructions soon followed. Friendly contact with the enemy was forbidden. Units were reminded that the war was far from over. In some sectors, artillery bombardments were deliberately ordered to bring the truce to an end. Other units were rotated to different positions so that the same opposing soldiers would not continue meeting. Gradually, the familiar sounds returned. Rifle fire, machine guns, artillery. The war resumed. For many soldiers, shooting at men they had spoken with only a day earlier proved emotionally difficult. Yet they obeyed their orders. The conflict continued for nearly 4 more years. As the war became more brutal, opportunities for another widespread truce disappeared. Poison gas was introduced in 1915. Battles became larger. Casualties climbed into the millions. The hatred created by years of fighting made spontaneous truces increasingly unlikely. Military commanders also took active steps to prevent another Christmas like the one in 1914. Large-scale fraternization never happened again. The Christmas Truce did not end the First World War. It did not change the outcome of the conflict. It did not bring lasting peace, but it left behind something perhaps even more powerful. Proof that even in one of history's deadliest wars, ordinary people could still recognize one another's humanity. For a few hours, the uniforms no longer mattered. Neither did the flags. The men standing in no man's land were simply fathers, sons, brothers, and friends who wanted to be home for Christmas. But the war continued. Millions more would lose their lives before it finally ended in 1918. Yet the memory of that Christmas survived, not because it changed history, but because it revealed something the history often tries to hide. Even in the darkest moments, compassion can survive. More than 100 years later, the Christmas Truce remains one of the clearest reminders that humanity can still appear where we expect it least. The guns did not stay silent, but for one Christmas, they did. This was a real tale from history.